Yes, are you recording? Oh, there it is.
Thank you. Okay, let's begin. Welcome back, everyone. Here we are in the course on environmental bioethics, the program of bioethics at St. Thomas University. Today, talking about natural succession and human population growth. Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you. We thank you for all your many blessings in the midst of the challenges and difficulties of our life. We ask you, Lord, to be with us, to know that you are with us, to guide us and to inspire us so that we may live according to your divine will, Lord. In a special way, we ask during this time, this extraordinary time of the viral infection of this new coronavirus throughout the world, to guide us, to inspire us, to have the proper behavior, the responsible behavior, so that we may finally stop this virus on its tracks, Lord, that is causing so much chaos throughout the United States and throughout the world. As always, we pray for those who are in most need of your divine mercy, in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, so a little bit of a protocol here as we go forward to remind you, first of all, that I'm going to mute all the microphones, so you can unmute when you need to speak, otherwise there's going to be background, okay? Also, to have, if you're going to speak, make a question or a comment, please unmute your microphone and then say your first name, all right? So say your first name, and that means that you want to make a comment, and then go ahead in a respectful manner. Try to keep it short. Try to keep your question or comments brief, okay? And allow me to finish the teaching part of it, and then we'll have time for discussion, especially in the second half, which will be more dialectic, all right? Okay, so let's go forward then. I hope that everyone can see the screen and hear me. Again, for those of you who are just joining now, I'm at the university again, at St. Thomas University. I'm recording from here where I have a better internet connection. Also, I have my cell phone with me here in case anyone is having any difficulty either seeing or hearing the lecture. You can call me, all right? I have it in front of me in mute, so just call me, all right? All right, so we're going to look at natural succession and human population growth today, population growth in general, and then applied to the human. Notice the sequence that we've been doing in this course in environmental bioethics. We started with looking at the natural world, all the way from its origin, very briefly, the process of accretion, all right, to where we have a crust that is solid enough to sustain life and has cooled down enough also to have liquid water on it. And so that begins the whole process as we looked at the geosphere, the atmosphere, the proper atmosphere today. We've gone, the climatologists, especially what is known as paleoclimatologists, those who study ancient atmosphere and climates. And they estimate that we've gone through maybe 4 different types of atmospheres, from one that is very toxic originally, high in toxic gases, to the benevolent atmosphere that we have today, especially the oxygen component of it, which again, I want to highlight that that happened through a natural process of photosynthesis, thanks to the cyanobacteria. So you can imagine the vast quantity of these cyanobacteria that existed probably close to 4 billion years ago, going back to almost the origin of the Earth, being 4.5 billion, to produce the oxygen basically that we're breathing today. Then we looked at the hydrosphere, and I mentioned briefly that I remember when I was at FIU studying biology in the 70s, all right, 1970s, not 1870s. And there was this fellow who came up with the idea that most of the water on Earth was picked up from space, from outer space. And scientists at that time thought that he was just crazy. He was out of his mind or out of this planet. However, he had made some calculations that the amount of oxygen and the amount of hydrogen that we have on Earth could not account for the combination of those elements to the amount of water that we have on Earth. And so his theory was that the Earth, as it has traveled through space for these 4.5 billion years, has been basically like a sponge that has been absorbing water molecules from space. And then that theory was confirmed at some point. I don't have the reference for it. I'm just remembering it anecdotally. But it's interesting to see how ideas that seem wacky at one point get confirmed eventually with the data, okay? But anyway, the hydrosphere, where we have this planet that on the crust is mostly water and liquid water, which allows for this beautiful possibility of life, all right? Then we looked at the cycles in nature, because nature is a very dynamic state where the elements are cycling and molecules are cycling, and for life is also cycling. And we need to get into the groove with cycling with regards to recycling, because we are, again, the only species that produces waste that endures way beyond any one of our generations, all right? The waste that this generation produces that is alive now has the potential to stay and contaminate for many, many generations to come. So there's something that is not fair about that, something that we need to take responsibility. And thanks be to God, little by little, I think that more and more people throughout the world, governments and just individuals, are becoming aware of this issue. And it's becoming, it's coming to the fore and to the rise, to the foreground, the whole issue of environmental stewardship, right? To be stewards of the environment and not just pillage it and destroy it. So then last lecture, I looked at energy and energy sources and the whole issue of the fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution, basically, more or less the past 250 to 300 years, were in a rise for a while up until last century. Now, little by little, those fossil fuels are diminishing. And as renewable sources of energy are coming into play, with human creativity being put to work. The challenge, of course, a big challenge with fossil fuels is that residue of about 4 gigatons annually of CO2 that keeps accumulating into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, thus contributing to global warming and so forth. We'll look at climate change as such with all its evidence in the following lecture, okay? Next lecture will be devoted to all of the complexities of climate change. But now I need to look at one more area that has a big nature component, natural component to it, which is succession and population growth, all right? And mostly in the second half of the lecture, we'll focus on human population growth in particular and the challenges and opportunities there. Okay, so again, I asked any questions or comments briefly from previous lectures or anything related to the topic.
Hi, Father, it's Maggie. I just wanted to let you know I got a text from Siobhan, and she's having some computer difficulties, but she's trying to reboot her computer and then she'll try to get in.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks be to Zoom that this will be recorded if everything goes well. And I say one little saying is technology is great when it works, right? And when it doesn't, it's very frustrating, which just points to the fact that we have become so dependent on technology. And I can remember back just a few short decades ago, even when I was studying at FIU, computers were just getting started, a real phone, and even if we go back before then, how did we manage without all the technology? You know, when we used to write actual letters and so forth. So
I'm here. I got in.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so let's move forward then with natural succession, which is in a sense another cycle, if you will. It's a series of cycles until the population stabilizes in nature, okay? So let's focus on that first. And it goes basically through these three stages: a pioneer stage, then intermediate stages of succession, and then finally a climax community. So these are the three main stages of a natural succession: the pioneers, the intermediate successions, and then finally the natural population settles down into a climax community. All right, another admit, okay. All right, so let's look at this a little more graphically. When we start with pioneer species, these are mostly plants and a few animals that venture into a barren area. That could be soil, sand, rock, all right? Some part of the geosphere that has initially no vegetation. And some pioneer species begin to settle there, mostly lichens, mosses. Interesting about lichens, because lichens are a combination of two different groups of plants. We have, or actually organisms. A lichen is a combination of fungi and algae, actually, okay? Several different types of lichens. They come in various colors, mostly shades of green and gray, but sometimes they can be reddish, orange, and so forth. Some are pretty and some are not. But the interesting thing about lichens is that the infrastructure is basically a fungus that gets populated by algae. So there you have, the fungus, remember, is not a plant, it's not an animal, but it is a heterotroph. In other words, it doesn't photosynthesize by itself. Rather, what the fungus does is a saprophyte, right? It's a decomposer. Together with bacteria, they release chemicals into the soil or into the organic material that is decomposing, and they speed up that decomposition process so that they absorb the nutrients from decomposing matter, basically dead plants, animals, etc. Okay, so those are the fungi, and these fungi get populated with algae inside. And the algae, of course, are autotrophs. They photosynthesize. That's why they have variations of green on their color. Okay. And then the algae are going to provide, through the process of photosynthesis, glucose, nutrients for the fungus. And the fungus will provide essentially a liquid environment, a humid environment inside the fungus for the algae to live, because algae need to live in water, in liquid water. Okay, and this is at the microscopic level. So one side product of the lichens is that they release chemicals, mostly some acids, organic acids, that decompose the rock, start breaking down rock, all right, into soil, into sediment. So they are great, lichens are great decomposers. In addition to the fungal component of it, that they're breaking down organic material, lichens can also break down inorganic material like a rock, all right? And so they make for great pioneer species. And they go into an area that is originally barren of life, and they start colonizing and populating that area. In the process, they're making little microscopic minerals that will eventually start forming some soil. Then mosses can also get established there, all right? And as soon as we have some autotrophs, Then some heterotrophs are going to follow, some small insects and other animals, maybe even small rodents will start chewing on these guys and feeding on them. So we start a whole cycle there, all right, of life. Eventually, enough soil is produced in the area and humidity is retained at what is known as the microclimate, which can be basically, you know, a square inch or something like that, or even smaller, so that a few more plants can come in and populate the area, mostly grasses and herbs, which again are pretty sturdy. They tend to have an extended root system underneath the ground, the soil, looking for water, precisely humidity, okay? And as these grasses and herbs die, they produce more organic material to be decomposed by the fungi, the lichens, and the bacteria, which itself would produce more humus, more organic material and minerals that will, nutrients that will mix with the soil to enrich that soil just naturally when left alone. Of course, adding the element of water here, which is crucial, periodic rains, and also the water percolating through the soil and so forth. So more herbs and grasses and maybe bushes begin to establish in that area. And this intermediate section here, this intermediate stage are actually the succession stages. Eventually, the mosses and the lichens will be replaced by herbs, bushes, grasses, all right, of many different types. Some are annuals, meaning that they'll die annually, and with the seeds, the seeds will germinate in the next season. Some are perennials, meaning that they will last several years alive, okay? But either way, whether they're annual or perennial, these grasses, shrubs, bushes, eventually get succeeded by ever larger, bigger plants, and also in general, larger, bigger, and more diverse animals coming into the area with primary consumers, which will be the herbivores, and then secondary and tertiary consumers, all the way up to the top carnivores, as we have spoken in previous lectures. Okay, so what I want to point out is that this intermediate section, several stages of succession go on here of various plants and animals, until eventually this area begins to stabilize into what is known as a climax community. All right, now in a climax community, we have already stable populations of plants and animals that live in the area generally. Even though some may migrate in and out, especially the animals, most of the plants and animals and fungi and even bacteria will be fairly stable in this area, meaning more or less the same populations that make up the community. Again, remember the terms here, right? Individuals of the same species coming together form populations of the same species, right? And then populations of different species coming together, they form communities. All right, so these terms are informative and specific, all right? Climax community meaning that unless the climate changes, the species that compose this community, the populations that compose this community pretty much will stay stable. Now, individuals will be succeeded. Individuals will be succeeded because animals, plants, bacteria, and fungi die at the individual level, but new individuals will come to replace them, all right, in the natural process. So there is a dynamic in nature that is always tending toward life and toward abundance of life and biodiversity. It's just like hardwired into nature, that nature, when left alone, tends toward being stabilized, toward biodiversity, all right, and toward exuberant. As many species and as many populations can be held in a particular ecosystem, that many on average will grow and flourish there, okay? And so typically at the vegetation level, and also at the animal level, we find that in a climax community, there will be the main trees, which are typically the largest trees, are called the dominant species. And these dominant species, sometimes it's just 1, 2, 3, or 4 different species of trees, okay? And they may even be in the same group. For example, I'm thinking of in a coniferous forest. In a coniferous forest, they're pine trees, they're conifers, all right, cone bearing. And so it may just be 2, 3, 4 species that make up that whole coniferous forest, which may cover hundreds of square kilometers of land. And this is the dominant species. Now, unless the climate changes, if the climate stays pretty much stable, that community has climaxed. It has reached its maximum potential by way of biodiversity, by way of number of individuals in each population, and so forth. And there will be succession at the individual level, but not at the level of species, not at the level of population, all right? So you notice when we add the climate to the community, right, to a particular community in a geographical area, then we have an ecosystem, because now the community is a reference to the biotic factors. In other words, the animals, plants, fungi, bacteria that live in the area. But when we add the climatological factors, which are abiotic or non-biotic, then we have an ecosystem as such, all right? And so we can go throughout the whole world and looking at different ecosystems. Some are small, some are large, most are some kind of a medium range size. And then various ecosystems coming together, finally they form the biomes, of which we have about a dozen throughout the world, including also the marine biomes. Okay, so basically these 3 stages of succession, beginning with the pioneer species, the more hardy ones, eventually get replaced by a number of intermediate populations of grasses, shrubs, or bushes, until eventually some trees start coming into the area. Enough soil is there for them to get established until that whole community stabilizes into a climax community with some dominant species of trees. And also there will be some dominant species of animals here, which typically are top carnivores, all right? The top carnivores, which will be fewer in number, and they typically have a large range. Some of those ranges can also overlap into various ecosystems, looking for food, foraging for food. With the big exception of Australia, at least until modern humans got there, where we don't have any top carnivores, we just have herbivores, because it happens that in Australia, in its natural setting, carnivores never developed, okay? They're all herbivores. At any rate, that's why Australia is also such an interesting place to observe from its natural environment, because there are no carnivores naturally. Like I say, until humans got there, maybe about 150 years ago, 200 years ago, they started introducing carnivores like foxes and other creatures, dogs, etc. Okay, let me move forward. And this is kind of a graphic representation of all the successions. And you start with what are known as forbs down here, then shrubs, young forests, mature, and then finally the climax forest, okay, where you have old growth, what is known as old growth. The old growth will have older trees in it. Some of them look a little barren because they've been around for decades, not years, but decades, maybe centuries, like some of the sequoias. Remember one time visiting Sequoia National Park in California, just spectacular. And these sequoias, which are conifers, I remember one time there's one there that is called, I think, Colonel Sherman or something like that. And these are so huge that you can't really see the top close by. You have to move so far back that if you try to see the top of the tree, you just fall back. You fall on your back. They're so tall. And there's one there that I think it's, let me see. Let me see if I get it right. It's 2,000 years old. Okay, here's the guy. 2,000 years old, and so started living around the time of Christ, different continent, of course. And the guide who was telling us the story, okay, said, oh yes, but and it's still living, all right, still living. So he said, oh yes, but this guy is really a youngster, because one time walking through the forest, we discovered one that had fallen already, and it was just the trunk laying there, all right? And they cut through the trunk and counting the core, counting the rings, that was 4,000 rings from the center to the bark, all right? 4,000 rings. So that guy, before it fell, was 4,000 years old. So there you have it, just majestic. When you have a chance, we have a spectacular national park system. I think it was Roosevelt, right, who started it. And the United States has been the model for many countries of the world to start national parks. And they are unique ecosystems that have at least two characteristics: a relatively large area, but most importantly, that is a unique ecosystem, And so not every state has a national park, all right? But some states have several national parks, like California and the West Coast in general, the real West Coast. But here in Florida, we have the privilege of having one national park, which is the Everglades, and it's worth seeing. It's a very delicate ecosystem. It's not a swamp at all. It's more like a slow-moving river, very wide and very shallow. There's also marine now. The Biscayne has been declared a national park also, but that's underwater. That's marine, which is, so actually we have two. Luis, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I think in the state of Florida, then we now have two national parks.
We also have the dry tortugas, Father.
Right.
Oh yes, right. It's not a national monument. It's a national park.
It's a national park.
Oh, great. Okay. So
I looked it up because I'm planning a trip. So yeah, there actually are three in the state.
all right.
Right.
Super.
We have Biscayne. We have Biscayne National Park, which is, as you said, mangrove and submerged vegetation with seagrasses, all that area near Turkey Point.
Yep.
That is in danger. And in park, not only as you mentioned, is that the river of grass with sawgrass, but also encompassing the mangrove part on the south
Yes.
of the 10,000 islands.
The
10,000 islands, and also Lone Pine, which is the largest pine rock and habitat outside urban development. And thank God that they declared that part as national park. Otherwise, it would have happened as the counterpart on the urban at Old Pine Rockland. There's only like 2% left of what was originally there. But with the area in Lone Pine Key, that would be like 30% or something like that.
Maybe it's a state park. Like Penny Camp, no?
No, Everglades National Park encompasses.
Oh no, Everglades. Yeah, I thought but Long Pine Key. That's part. So that's part of Everglades.
That's part of the Everglades.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank
They
you.
incorporated a portion that was, I think, a county park. There's an entrance on the 8.5 square mile. It's part of the Everglades as well now.
Super. Yeah. Okay. So we're privileged down here. You notice that it all occurs down south here, south from us, down south. Okay. Very unique ecosystems that we have, and delicate. It takes knowledge. The challenge is ignorance, of course, because we can't really love what we don't know. But once we get to know the area and its delicate ecosystem, it's very interesting. All the plants and animals that live in the area. Then there are Ocala, of course, but Ocala is a national forest, okay? It's not a park as such, it's a national forest. But it also has a very beautiful area up in northern Florida. Okay, let me move forward then. So you see the succession. This implies a stable climate. Now, a stable climate is not a static climate, all right? We have to understand that even a stable climate is in a dynamic state, meaning that typically there are seasons, and there are seasons that flow and ebb and flow, meaning that there could be, for example, in the more tropical region, the two main seasons will be the wet and the dry season, because around the equator and more or less 30 degrees north and south geographically latitude gives us a swath of about 60 degrees around the Earth. What we have is more or less a stable temperature, all right? And therefore, the big significant climatological factor there that is going to cycle more is going to be the rain or no rain, more or less water. All right, so we'll have that wet season and dry season. But as we move into the temperate regions, both north and south, again, from 30 to 60 degree latitude, both north and south, keeping in mind that most of the landmass is in the northern hemisphere, then we get the temperate region. And in the temperate region, the 4 seasons kick in more or less evenly, so that we have summer, fall, spring, and what did I miss? Winter and spring, all right, the 4 seasons. And that has more diversity to it with regards to the temperature. The temperature is the one that's fluctuating more and is determining where there is more or less water, but also whether the water is in a liquid or in a solid form, like snow, okay? So those plants and animals have to adapt accordingly. And we see the transition from a tropical rainforest around the equator swath into the temperate regions of a mixed forest or deciduous forest. Deciduous meaning that the leaves lose their leaves, that the trees lose their leaves in the fall. That's why it's called fall or autumn, because the leaves fall off, right? And then winter, the trees are no leaves, but they're not dead. They're dormant. They're dormant, so they go into a dormant state. The sap slows down, but then the evergreens, the conifers, get to survive because instead of sap, they have a resin, which have much less water content, and it doesn't freeze. It continues to circulate slowly through the tree, all right, and keeping the tree alive. And that's why they're called evergreen, because these conifers have adapted so that they can survive the winter season and still photosynthesize. So that's their chance to grow ever more slowly, but that's how they get a leg up on the deciduous trees in the wintertime particularly, okay? And at the end of fall, winter, moving into spring. And as we move further north, both north and south, from 60 degrees, let's say more or less hypothetically, latitude up until the polar caps, then we go into the coniferous forest, which is dominated mostly by evergreens, by conifers, all right? And they are evergreen because they have also other adaptations like needles instead of leaves, so that snow doesn't accumulate in a significant way on top of them and doesn't break them off, because snow after a while gets heavy and can collapse even rooftops and so forth. So a needle accumulates by volume much less, by surface, accumulates much less snow than an actual flat leaf. All right, so these are adaptations of the conifers. And then the other adaptation they have, of course, is they have cones instead of flowers. And you can just imagine graphically that a cone is much more hardy than a flower, especially in the harsh winter season, okay? All right, so I'm saying all this also to prep you up a little bit, because I'm going to talk about our coniferous forest here in not only Miami, but in actual St. Thomas University, our pine forest. Anyway, So these are the stages here of succession until we come to the stable climate, which implies cycling, yearly, mostly annual cycling, but even cycle at a bigger scale, at the scale of decades and centuries and even millennia, when we look at the glacial and interglacial periods, which we can say mostly is going to be the largest cycle, if you will, the most long-term cycle on Earth that we can tell so far is probably the glacial interglacial periods. And that will be on the longest scale of time, all right, but cycles. So it's a dynamic state that is going on in a very slow way. To all the way crunch it down to the smallest cycle that we can have, that I can think of, beyond the day, smaller than the day, because the obvious big cycle in the day is, of course, light and no light, between day and night, literally. But even within a day, the cycle, for example, of rain, like we've been having rain like crazy these days, okay, the past 24 hours, but now it stopped. So within an hour, half an hour, we can have a cycle of rain, no rain. And that has an effect on the microclimate, which has an effect on the bigger climate and the bigger picture of the whole ecosystem. All this to point that it is really in a dynamic state of complexity. So to study ecology is a much more complex task than just to study the biology, the botany, the zoology of any particular species or population or even communities, all right? However, at the end of the day, it all starts with the individual species. It all starts with the individuals within any species. All right, moving forward, I want to show you that I've been prepping you for this. We have our own actually coniferous forest here in Dade County, in Miami, at St. Thomas University. So here's an aerial photograph of our campus, right? Here's the entrance, 37th Avenue. And just above here would be the Palmetto Expressway. This is the service road of the Palmetto, 167th Street. All right, so we are in this building. I am actually in this building somewhere about halfway here in the classroom where you have been before. So you can see that the campus can be more or less divided into two parts. If we draw a diagonal from the northeast to the southwest, and we have pretty much like a square. I'll give you the measures in a minute. We can draw a diagonal more or less here, okay? And up until now, the north quadrant here, this half, this northwest half triangle has been respected because of the trees that we have here. So you notice that the development, the urbanization, all right, has occurred in this lower triangle. Beginning with the very first building, which was this one, Ducane College, 50 years ago, and the original entrance was here, 32nd Avenue. There's an actual statue of St. Thomas of Villanova, which was not Thomas Aquinas. Thomas of Villanova was an Augustinian priest, bishop from the town of Villanova in Spain, and he was also, well, he was an Augustinian, and he was also rector of a university in the 16th century, all right? So the university was named after him because of the Spanish Augustinians who came from the American Augustinians who came here back in 1960 when they were expelled from Cuba. They had Universidad Villanueva in Cuba, the Augustinian friars. Castro kicked them out, so they came here. They spoke with Bishop Carroll at that time, the first bishop of Miami. And they said, look, we had a university in Cuba, Universidad Villanueva, Catholic, and many of our students are here today in Miami. I'm talking about 1960s. And we'd like to restart the university. And Carroll said, well, I'll tell you what, I have the land, which you have to, with your mind's eye, erase all these buildings, go back 60 years and repopulate this whole square with a slash pine, all right? It was a whole pine forest here. Excuse me. So Carroll said to the Augustinians, I have the land undeveloped, start the university and we'll go forward and we'll see what happens. So they built this building, which is called Ducane College. To this day was the original building of the university. And a little later, they built this little monastery where they live, which is still kind of embedded in the forest here at the edge. All right. Excuse me. And so that's how St. Thomas University started originally as Biscayne College. And at the very, very first, it was mostly men, boys, who had come from Universidad Villanueva in Havana, like I say. And then there was Barry College. If you go east from here, on the other side of I-95 into Miami Shores, from Miami Gardens to Miami Shores, different neighborhood. And that was run, Barry College was run by the Dominican nuns, still to this day, from Adrian, Michigan. They come from Michigan, Dominican nuns, and that was Barry College, and it was mostly for girls, the first, you know, so Biscayne College was with the boys here, and Barry College was girls over there. Eventually, both places became universities and so forth, and co-ed. The Agustinians got older and fewer, and they left because they couldn't hold the place anymore. In the meantime, Carroll died, and we had Archbishop McCarthy back about 20 years ago, more or less, a little more, about 30 years. And he had to make the decision because the land has always been diocesan, always belonged to the Archdiocese of Miami. But the actual campus belonged to the Agustinians. So McCarthy had to decide either sell the land or buy the university. And he decided to buy the college. He bought the college from the Agustinians and renamed it to St. Thomas University, and now it's diocesan. So it's Archdiocesan University. It's one of the very few. There are only about 8 or 9 diocesan universities in the whole United States. So we're trying to make a go of it and try to survive against, obviously, the public universities that get state money and so forth, and even private universities like UM, which are tier 1 research. So we, small little St. Thomas, is trying to survive in this environment and make a go of it. So one of the possible survival, we have to look for our niche, right? So one of our niches is Catholicity, but you know, Barry is also Catholic. So what else do we have that Barry doesn't have? Well, the forest. This is unique. This Dade County /forest/pine forest ecosystem, all right? It's not just individual trees, of which we have about 200, but the actual forest itself. So it's the ecosystem that is occurring here, together with the understructure that is that composes the forest, all the animals also that live in here, and even down to the fungi that live on the ground that keep the root system alive and so forth. So we're trying to preserve this forest desperately. This picture is actually dated. I just didn't have time to see if Google has the new picture with the new building, which is the business building, which takes up essentially this quadrant here, this little square like this. Used to be a gravel parking lot. I don't know if you had the chance to know the gravel parking lot, all right? But this is a succession, a human artificial succession that I have seen in many universities throughout the United States and throughout the world. It starts with a natural environment, it turns into a parking lot, and eventually it turns into buildings, okay? And that's a one-way succession that is anything but natural. It's artificial. Of course, I understand we have to live somewhere, we have to teach somewhere, we have to put classrooms somewhere, not in thin air, all right? But how do we strike a balance to maintain the last remaining highland /pine, Dade County /pine forest ecosystem, that's a mouthful, that exists in the county, all right? Of which the whole thing here is about 30 acres. But the core of it may be half of that. And we're trying to preserve this desperately, okay? Because truly is the last /pine forest ecosystem that is standing in the county that is highland. And I want to highlight the highland aspect of it because we're sitting on a lot of sand. There is /pine in the southern part of the county. It's known as Rockland Pine, and actually that is even more endangered than this one, and it's protected. some of it, a lot of it is in public property or property that has already been covenanted, all right? And it's the same species, perhaps a different variety, but at least the same species of Pinus elioti, which is a scientific name for slash pine, the county slash pine, all right? But the big difference, and it's very visible, the difference between our slash pine population and the one in the southern part of the county, which is known as Rockland Pine, is just a sheer size, all right? They don't get to be this large and this massive all the way around. I mean, I can tell you from experience, there's some trees in here, some specimens, that it actually takes two people with their arms stretched out to go around the trunk, all right? Actually, two people to go around the trunk of some of these trees that we have in the forest. They're massive. Whereas down in the Rockland area, the word says it, they grow, the same pine, the same species grows literally on top of lime rock, on limestone, okay, which is fossilized coral. It is our natural rock here in South Florida. And so this pine is very tenacious and manages to leach out some nutrients and water from that limestone and stay alive. But they grow spindly, thinner, and not as bushy as they grow here, because here we have sand, quite a bit of sand underneath, and that's why it's called a highland. It can just be 6 or 8 feet above sea level, but that's sufficient when you put all that sand together down to the water table, so that the root system gets spread out massively. And I can tell you that the slash pine, for example, many pines have this, but slash pine, the root system, so we have two parts of the tree, this applies for any tree, and in fact any plant. There is the root system, which is underground and we don't see, that's the root system, right? But what comes up from the ground up, that's called the shoot system, the shoot, all right? Because it literally shoots up the ground, all right? And I can tell you for these pines, the root system can be anywhere between 2 to 4 times the size of the shoot system. So whatever pine we see looking at this, and these are Climax Community, all right? These are mature, established. The root system of this fellow could be anywhere between 2 to 4 times its size underneath. Totally established, well established here. In fact, that root system may tap all the way down into the groundwater, where there is a continuous flow of water there, or fresh water. So it's all set. Once it taps into the groundwater and the aquifer, then it's all set. You know, it doesn't depend as much on the rain itself, okay? But these trees are very hardy, they're beautiful, they are conifers, they're pines. So this is a conifer forest that we have here, all right? And what is a slash pine forest doing in a subtropical environment that we have in South Florida? We should have, by the way, a little more temperate climate by way of latitude. However, because of the prevailing southeast winds that we get from the Caribbean, it makes our local climate a little more warmer and more humid. So really we have a subtropical climate. And these conifers are not only surviving, but thriving, to the point that before the saw got here, I'm talking about the iron saw, all right, got here to Florida, and mostly South Florida, but Florida in general. I'm talking about maybe 150 years ago. So the whole peninsula was covered with slash pine, all right? The whole peninsula, especially along the coast, was covered with slash pine. What was not slash pine was basically Everglades. And that was since the last ice age, which was about 10,000 years ago, receded. So for about the past 10,000 years, more or less, the whole peninsula was basically covered with these majestic trees because we had a climax community. It was stable. After the last ice age, the climate started stabilizing and we went gradually into this interglacial period, all right? Possibly toward a tropicalization very slowly. And these slash pine got to survive down here and adapted, even though they are conifers. And so they were the Climax, they were the dominant trees of the Climax community. And then, like I said, about 150 years ago, more or less, around the end of the 1800s, the saw was introduced and cut down, and because they make for very good wood for construction. They make good wood because they're resistant to a lot of the termites and creatures that we have here because of the resin instead of the sap and so forth. And they're large. And so anyway, they started constructing. The early settlers, the early colonizers here of, I'm talking about modernity, again, the end of the 1800s, started cutting them down, and right there on that same spot, building their cabins and their towns and so forth. So these forests started disappearing for urbanization, little by little. And move it fast forward to the fact that now, at the end of the day, we have maybe 1 to 2% of slash pine left, okay? 1 to 2% in the whole state and the whole, in South Florida. And we have a big part of that 1% here right on our campus. And so that's what we're trying to preserve, okay? Okay, more to come on the slash pine forest, and I have an idea that hopefully will get us all out there a little, maybe moving into next month and so forth. But sit tight and continue to pray that we may be able to open in the fall for face-to-face classes, including the hybrids and so forth, and we'll have a chance to get into the forest. But that's what we're trying to preserve. Anyway. Development continues here. There are plans to do more development at the university, but we're hoping and praying hard that this area will be preserved, including this other spot here that is across the road, which is also part, it be considered part of the ecosystem because plants, animals move across the road, especially at night when we don't see them. And birds, of course, have no problem with the road itself. So there are populations of jaybirds, there are population of blue jays, cardinals, robins, all kinds of birds. In here, of course, the, the mockingbird and so forth that live in the area, okay? All right, let me move forward. Let's look now at what is a typical natural population growth curve, all right? This applies to most species, again, of animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, anything that is living on Earth at the species level, at the population level, at the individual level, all right? But let's stay at the population level. The populations typically follow this type of curve where we have in the horizontal axis, the y-axis, the x-axis, the independent variable, time, all right, because time inexorably moves forward, whether we like it or not, and with a chronology of time, we can put even in increments, even size increments, whether it's seconds, years, millennia, whatever, of the same size on the x-axis, all right, moving horizontally. So as time moves on the horizontal axis, we can look at number of individuals, actual number of individuals, 1, 2, 3, 4 millions, etc. On the y-axis, which is the dependent variable. And this is the kind of graph that we get. We get essentially 3 stages, more or less, 3 stages, to greater or lesser intensity of growth. We get a lag phase, then we get a log phase, and when we get a stationary phase, all right? So the lag phase is slow growing, and then the log phase goes into exponential growth, essentially a duplication of the population until the resources start maxing out, and then the growth starts to slow down, all right, where we get more deaths than births. and eventually will reach a stationary phase where the number of deaths and the number of births equal out, all right, so that there's the population stabilizes. And this is essentially when we add each population within a community, this basically becomes a climax community here when the main populations of that community stabilize out here, all right? Okay, so let's go back to it in a little more detail. Like I mentioned, it's a geometric progression. It's not arithmetic, because arithmetic will give us a straight line. Arithmetic will be a growth in number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all right? And that will be in a direct linear proportion to time. So 1, imagine here in hours or days, whatever scale I put down here, but there is an even amount of increments. And if we put the numbers here as an even amount of increments also, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what we're going to get is a straight line. So the slope will be a straight line, and that implies a linear relationship, arithmetic progression. Not that type of progression for life, all right? For natural populations, the progression is geometric, all right? And that's mostly because the individuals that are born, the individuals who are giving birth to other individuals are still around. And typically, the typical progression is 2 to 1, 2 to 1. And so what we get is a geometric progression, all right? A geometric progression is a doubling of the population in general, the doubling of population or even more. So a simple doubling is just from 1, 2, from 2, 4, because each one of those 2 splits again. Think of mitosis, think of cellular division, right? From one cell, we get 2 daughter cells. From one mother cell, 2 daughter cells, so that's from 1 to 2. But each one of those 2 daughter cells grows into mother cells. They each split, and then we get 4, right? 2 from one daughter cell, 2 from the other daughter cell. These 4 granddaughter cells will then split into 2 more each, so that's 8. So the progression is geometric. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, etc. All right? So you can see that with each cellular division, the population duplicates. So it goes from the lag phase into a log phase, where the population is at least duplicating, if not more. That's in the least case scenario, let's say, of a simple geometric progression of doubling, all right, x to the 2, or y to the 2, to the second power. But it could be y to the 3 or 4 or to the 1,000. For example, when fish reproduce, you know, the female fish lays out thousands of eggs on the seabed or the grass bed, whatever soil, whatever surface. And then the male will lay out the smelt, which is the sperm, which is in the millions. So on average, many of those eggs will be fertilized. And so that geometric progression is y to the n, where n is the number of eggs that the female laid, all right? And then we have to put n minus m, and the m now is the number of eggs that did not get fertilized, et cetera, et cetera. So we can adjust the equation, but basically this log phase almost goes vertical, all right? So that in a relatively short period of time, the number of individuals, the population is doubling and doubling and doubling. So it increases in number of individuals very, very fast in the log or exponential phase. But then what happens? These individuals are alive and they're eating and feeding and so forth, and they're competing for natural resources. So eventually those resources are going to max out, right? And what happens is we never have unlimited resources at the natural level. We always have limited resources, whether it's light, nutrients, blades of grass or mice running around, etc. Whatever the resources are for feeding are going to be limited. And so with a fast exponential growth, that population is going to start to max out, so that there's not enough resources to maintaining that fast rate of growth. And that rate of growth at the population level is going to start diminishing, slowing down, until eventually it stabilizes. And this implies that the resources are renewable resources, seasonably and so forth. And so the resources will be renewed and cycled, right? So that the population at the natural level starts stabilizing, okay? And at some point here, the number of births equals the number of deaths for each population at the individual level for that population. And when you put those populations together into a community, you have a climax community, you have a stable community as long as the climate stays more or less stable, all right? And that, my friends, is called the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. So each ecosystem has its own carrying capacity, which is determined mostly what are the critical factors that determine the carrying capacity of each population within an ecosystem. What are the factors, the more critical factors that determine the carrying capacity? How many individuals of each population can this ecosystem, this local area carry, literally by way of number of individuals, all right? Sustain.
Yeah.
Are these going to be mostly biotic or abiotic factors that determine the carrying capacity? Think about it for a moment. See? Biotic would be the actual living creatures, right? All the different species that make up all these populations of the community. But the abiotic factors are the climatological factors and the soil factors, etc. So it's the abiotic factors that determine the carrying capacity of any particular region. And that's why emphasizing again the climate. As long as the climate stays more or less stable over cycles, which could be cycles of years, decades, millennia, all right? As long as that climate stays stable over those cycles, then each population of many different species will reach their carrying capacity and maintain a stable ecosystem, all right? Okay, and that has happened in nature over millennia. And so when we as humans land on Earth and look around and see, we see these more or less stable populations throughout all the biomes that make our Earth green and thriving with life, with organic life. Okay, a couple more details. This curve is called a sigmoid curve, which is the Greek word for the letter sigma, which is kind of an S shape, right? If you pull the S by its two tails, you get a sigmoid curve like this, and that's the typical growth curve of a population, all right, which is with its three phases, the lag phase, the log phase, and the stationary phase. And you understand the dynamics of what's going on there. Basically, at the beginning, there are abundant resources, right? But as the population grows, those resources begin to max out until the population actually stabilizes. What happens here then, we have competition at the height, right? So individuals within each population are competing with each other for the same basic resources. And so selection kicks in, right? Selection kicks in here with the survival of the fittest, the survival of the one that has the greatest potential to survive. Looking for the word, the variation, variation. Remember, we also defined variation. It's going back to the first course that I taught. Within variation, within adaptedness, right? Within each population. Okay, so this applies to any species that we're looking at, any particular population of plants, animals, etc. So here we have a local ecosystem of grasses. You can see various different types of grasses that are all competing for that patch of soil and more or less the same sunlight that is hitting this area and the same amount of rain and so forth. So all of these grasses are in competition with each other, and they will stabilize out to a nice prairie of many, many individuals forming the various populations that make up all these little grasses here, okay, in this local area. It could be a very localized area like this, a few, few meters large, maybe less than a kilometer square, or it could be a huge range, like we have here with these puma top carnivores or cougars, whatever they are, mountain lions, the same as our Florida panther, more or less, I think the same species, maybe different varieties. Because they're top carnivores, they need a huge range of foraging for food, all right? We can see a carcass here of something. So it could be 2 individuals in the population, or it could be thousands of individuals in a population, or it could be domesticated, like these cows on the range here, that they will, this patch of grass, right, will support X number of cows. And if we put too many cows here, they're going to overgraze, and then they will not be sustained. They'll start getting skinny because there are too many cows in here. All right, so there's a stable number that can be sustained in this particular patch. So what the farmers do when this patch starts getting depleted, they'll move to another patch and so forth. This applies even down to bacteria, which are here in a photograph. This is a macro photograph that has been colorized for our benefit. And this is the tip of a pin, the proverbial tip of the pin with individual bacteria. We can see here that these are bacilli, the long-shaped type of, rod-shaped type of bacteria that are populating this tip of the pin. We can imagine that this will be millions of bacteria, but it's a limited number. It's not an infinite number of bacteria that fit on the tip of this pin, okay? It may be in the millions, but it's a limited number because at some point they run out of space and they run out of nutrients for survival. Okay. Now, when we apply these concepts to the human population, and again, remember that we as a species are considered to be one population throughout the entire Earth, all right? And as far as I know, we are the only species that constitute a single population throughout the world, okay? Again, this is a concept where some people, again, have a little bit of a challenge. Just understanding that a population in biology, in nature, is made up of one particular species, okay? We can have various populations of the same species, but the population is inhabiting a particular geographical region, so that we can have, hypothetically, different populations of the same species in different parts of the world. And at some point, those populations of the same species will start to not recognize each other. And even though to us, they look and sound the same, all right? For example, a population of mockingbirds. Let's say we have a population of mockingbirds here at St. Thomas University. Let me do this for a moment. Let's see if I can pull up a Google Earth here. Oh no, let's see. I just trying to get a map. Yes.
Check an email that I sent with a screenshot.
Screenshot. Okay. Ah, okay. Updated. Thank you very much. Yes.
Right. There's another polygon on the southwest that I forgot to add. It's about 5 acres, like 5.5 roughly. The one up is about, as you said, 25 acres roughly, leaving edges out. The core is like 15, I would say, as you mentioned as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is updated. Thank you very much. You can see here the new building is already impinging into the forest. All right. And I can tell you, because I drove through here this morning with all the rain and everything else, they have planted here a lot of slash pine. They counted slash pine juveniles, small. There may be 6 to 8 feet tall, all right? So they're nice juveniles, all this. But these are individual plantings, similar to what we have here near the parking lot. You've seen these slash pines, even if they are mature, large specimens and established. Underneath, there's lawn. And I see the grass mower going through here periodically. So this is manicured. This is not manicured, all right? This is a native forest. And so even if this whole area here is covered with new slash pines, there will be individuals, all right? And even to the point that where they're putting actual palmetto palm underneath to simulate the original vegetation, but it's still not an ecosystem. Not an ecosystem because of all the intricate detailed animals and plants and fungi and bacteria that live in this area as a whole ecosystem. Okay, many, many, many different species and varieties and populations that live in this area. All right, yeah, thanks. Okay, so what did I want to do? Oh yeah, I wanted to look for a moment at just to emphasize graphically even this hopefully will do it. I'm just trying to get to a map. Here, I think this will do it. I can turn it into the satellite view. Please give me a sec. Here we go. I'm getting there. All right. So here's a satellite view of Broward County. Let's find where we are. Further down, my back past it, Hard Rock. Oh, interchange. Here we go, St. Thomas. All right, so let's look at this area for a moment. Here we are again. And you can see our forests in the context of the local neighborhood. Here is our forest, if I could get rid of that thing. All right, and you can see that the rest is pretty much urbanized, quite a bit. But I wanted to point out, for example, there's some greenery here. So let's say that we have, okay, let's do this. You see some greenery here and some greenery here, all right? So let's say that hypothetically, because there's an expressway here and there's 27th Avenue, these are major divides. So some land creature, let's put a population of mice here and a population of mice here, okay? The same species of mice will have a population of mice here and we'll have a population of mice here, just field mice. The same species, it's highly unlikely that these two populations of mice of the same species will interact. So if we run it forward for decades and maybe centuries, there will come a time when this population of mice of the same species will not recognize this population of mice of the same species, will not recognize each other. Specifically, male and females will not recognize the opposite sex. Okay, so they will not intermate. They may look identical to us when we catch one of these field mice here, one of these field mice here. They may look identical to us, but they look very different to each other. Could be the smell or something like that, okay? And so they will not interbreed, they will not mate, even though they are the same species, but they're different populations. And this is the beginning of speciation. If we run this fast forward a few more millennia, we may eventually get two different subpopulations of mice here, which may eventually lead to speciation. If there are other different factors, maybe particular types of seeds that are here that are not here, or the microclimate that is here, that is not here, that this one fosters more bigger ears and this one fosters more longer tails for whatever reason. And we may eventually begin a process, or nature will begin a process of speciation, all right? This for the human does not happen, does not happen. Rather, for the human, what we have is one single population throughout the whole Earth. Okay, this is significant. This has bioethical implications. This has social implications. What I'm saying basically graphically is that in principle, any fertile male, human male on Earth can fertilize any fertile female on Earth, human female, all right? So what does that do to race or ethnicity? It puts them squarely into the cultural setting, all right? So that, for example, an African male who is fertile biologically can, in principle, mate with an Alaskan female, all right, who, again, in principle, is fertile and have fertile offspring. In other words, their offspring, which I don't know what they're going to look like, but they're going to look human. Their offspring will be fertile in principle. It's not a hybrid, okay, because it's the same species. And so basically that means that race is strictly a cultural construct. And just like we constructed it, we can deconstruct it also, okay? And ethnicity also. They're cultural constructs, all right, that were established centuries ago. And as you can see, they're becoming more challenged today and more difficult and complex. There's still some forms that you can find in some government agencies where it says, are you Hispanic or are you Caucasian, right? And I'm both. And so there was this misconception that Hispanics somehow were not Caucasian, all right? Or are you Hispanic or are you Caribbean? I don't know. But you see, these race and ethnicity are totally cultural constructs, okay? And they have their limitations, big limitations, and they're coming to, we're seeing those limitations now in times of stress on the population, the human population. But so we have to be very, very respectful about the fact that we are a single population throughout the entire Earth, okay? We all belong to the same species, and therefore we all are body and soul one, and therefore we are all afforded the intrinsic dignity that God has given us by being God's image. I forgot to mention at the beginning of lecture that actually this lecture begins with the biological and ends with the theological, all right? And so in the first half of the lecture, more or less, I've been talking about the biological facts of succession up to stable climax communities. And in the second part, I'll be shifting more and more into the bioethical and the theological facts of our Catholic theology, all right? So not only this course, but the whole program, of course, is seen under the lens of Catholicity and the Catholic teaching that the good Lord gives us to handle and deal with these very, very complex issues that we have of human population growth, all right, which exhibiting this kind of curve, this kind of growth curve. So these are approximate numbers and estimates, but fairly reliable. Here we go, starting anywhere from 2 to 5 million years ago. Remember, this is at the level of genus, Homo, and we can include other non-sapiens homos here, right? Where you want to put the soul, it's up to you. We talked about that. I bring it all the way down to whether Neanderthal had a soul or not. And some of the evidence for that, in my opinion, is mostly two things that we have discovered so far, that anthropologists have discovered, is clothing beyond the warmth, clothing of the genitals, essentially, for pudor, what do you call for the fact that I'm looking for indirect evidence of a conscience, all right? And I point to two factors: the clothing, beyond the clothing on top of covering their chest for warmth, which could be a natural thing without a conscience, just instinctive, clothing their genital parts, the midsection, what's it called? Anyway, not for warmth at all, but mostly for shame, right? And
Right.
tying it up with the biblical passage of before the fall, before I'm not talking about the autumn, I'm talking about the fall of humanity from Genesis 2 to Genesis 3. Before the fall, in the natural state, humans felt no shame. They were naked and felt no shame, all right? And then after the fall, they made loincloths, the loins, that's what I was looking for. They made loincloths because they felt shame, and the passage. And the other indirect evidence is burying their dead. Burying their dead, pointing to some beginning belief of an afterlife, and which would arise from a conscience that God has planted there, right? Because our parents couldn't give us a conscience. So anyway, I'm digressing too much here, but basically the Homo, at some point, it's Homo Sapiens, which we, from some evidence, it seems like we outlived and killed out with competition, competing for the same resources. Mostly it seems to be in temperate Europe and Eurasia. We, Homo Sapiens, outlived and killed out Neanderthal, even though they were bigger, more muscular, and even had more cranial capacity on average than we did. And then Homo sapiens, all right? So when we get into the thousands of years, we're definitely into the only Homo species that has survived, Homo sapiens. Very long lag phase. Look at this, very long lag phase, several thousand years ago. What is symbolic about 7,000 years BC, right? Which would be about 9,000 years from now. It is more or less attributed to the beginning of agriculture. And so more or less, this indicates that significant transition, very, very subtle, but well, maybe not so subtle, but very significant transition from hunter-gatherers to settlers, okay, to settlers. And that transition is attributed mostly to agriculture, to beginning to plant stuff where we can get enough nutrition out of it to survive, all right, in small clans and tribes. And so this allows us, the Homo sapiens, to stay in a particular region instead of wandering around after the animals, the herds, semi-wild herds and so forth, or even wild herds. There was basically no time for developing culture, for developing material culture, all right, when we were hunter-gatherers. And we make that transition into agriculture, then to settlers, we have a little more time on our hands to ponder, to reflect, to make tools, and to make tools that make tools, all right, like the flint stones, literally, that cut other stones. So tool making, tools that make tools, because we know some animals use very rudimentary tools, like little twigs and so forth, but making a tool that makes a tool, is another level of magnitude that we haven't seen in other species. And so these were huge leaps forward by way of settling and increasing our material culture, which could also be called technology. And in the primitive stages of agriculture, primary agriculture, basically just throwing a seed somewhere and then instinctively gathering the larger grains from the individuals of that germination and using those larger grains or more abundant yield to plant those. And we start getting into artificial selection, right? Selecting for the bigger grain or the larger fruit and so forth. Keep planting those. And we go into secondary agriculture, which is channeling water Primary agriculture is just throwing a seed and sitting, waiting for the rain to fall and germinate and so forth. Letting nature take its course, very slow and low yield. Secondary agriculture is already channeling water into canals, and that allows for more settling, right? Mostly near rivers and freshwater sources, lakes, etc. Tertiary agriculture is making dams and making reservoirs and managing water better for better yield and settling more into areas more permanently, accumulating grain and storing over the winter season when there's no yield, and so on and so forth. We get into quaternary agriculture, which is more heavy machinery comes into play and technology. And then you can talk about quaternary or maybe fivefold agriculture with hydroponics, where plants are grown essentially in a totally artificial nutrient environment, more and more independent of actual soil, of actual acreage, all right? And then the chain, the food chain that follows that agriculture with the cattle, the domestication of cattle and other animals for yielding mostly high protein and also lipids that are needed in a diet, in a balanced diet, etc. Fast forward about 7,000 years into the civilizations that we know, the Middle Ages, going through all the ages, the Stone Ages, the Bronze Ages, the Iron and Metal. And once we get into metal, then technology keeps increasing more and more, machinery, so on and so forth. The Middle Ages, there was one dip here, which was the Black Death, the plague, the bubonic plague that wiped out several times because there were several waves over the years and decades of the bubonic plague, mostly in Europe, at least that there's some record of. So we can look back here for some inkling of what we should be doing moving forward with this coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-19, which is the new strain, the novel strain of the coronavirus. As I mentioned, it's about the 8th or 9th strain of coronavirus that is hitting the world population now, okay, unprecedented, because we did not have the airplane back 100 years. Even when we look at the Spanish plague, it was a pandemic in a mild, in a limited way, not mild, sorry, in a limited way, a pandemic, mostly Europe that we know of. Who knows what other continents were being affected by the Spanish flu, but that we have record of was mostly Europe. But this one is truly worldwide. Okay, so maybe perhaps for the first time in our history, we can actually call it a true pandemic. Pan meaning universal, pan meaning throughout the entire earth. All right, and a lot of human behavior is involved in this pandemic, all right, in this current pandemic. From the get-go, of getting into wild animals and so forth. Next lecture, hopefully we'll discuss a little bit of that. But anyway, I want to point out to the very slow lag phase to a very fast log phase, all right, which had to do a lot with improvement in the Middle Ages with sanitation and starting to be more healthy and slowing down the mortality rate of humans, which began mostly with the Renaissance period at the end of the Middle Ages as we transition from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance here, okay? More health habits. I can point to one particular, for example, the fork is attributed to Florence Renaissance period, whereby we don't need to eat with our hands anymore, contaminating our food that we put into our mouths from the hands have been touching everything in sight before we get that chunk of food. Using a fork was an elegant thing and actually was a major contributor to our health, okay? Way before we discovered the germ theory, which actually happened much later in the 19th century, of actual, the germ theory of the contamination of microorganisms of the food and associating that contamination with disease. Okay. But anyway, this log phase has been mostly in the past 500 years. It has skyrocketed to doubling the population of the Earth almost every generation. And by the way, a human generation is considered about 20 years, okay? A human generation is considered about 20 years. You think about it, yes, we hit biological maturity, physiological maturity in about the first decade, all right? But then in other words, women start producing mature eggs on average around year 10, the age 10 more or less, and men maybe 1 or 2 years later mature sperm. So the first decade more or less, biologically, physiologically, we become sexually mature. But then it takes about another decade more or less to the psychological factor to catch up by way of being able to parent. And I'm talking about even in the natural setting of being skillful enough for parenting the children, enough to have beyond a survival rate, all right, which for the human species, again, is 2.1. I'll talk about the 2.1 in a minute, but now I just wanted to focus on the fact that a human generation is estimated to be about 20 years, more or less. In other words, that succession is every 20 years when we take the global population into consideration, okay? All right, so this log phase that we have engaged for the past 500 years seems to have no end to it, all right? But we do have limited resources, and even though agriculture has played a big part in this, a huge part in this, because we have stretched out our resources to where we don't depend anymore on natural resources. Well, yeah, natural resources, but we're growing our own food essentially. We're growing our own food, okay? And so this puts us way out of the picture with other natural populations that depend on the food, the nutrition that is available to them, all right? And the only other example that I can see that kind of parallels us a little bit in a very primitive way, by way of agriculture or harvesting something, would be the ants. The ants, that they actually, especially these ants that are carpenter ants and harvester ants, they cut down the forest, okay, and take those little chunks of leaf into their nests, the ant hills underneath on the ground. And what they do, they don't actually eat those leaves. What they do is they just lay it out there until it rots. And then what is going to come into that, those rotten leaves on the ground in their nests, in their ant hills, is fungi. But fungi of particular species, okay? And have developed a commensal system where they provide a benevolence because the fungi will continue the decomposition, the saprophytic effect on the rotten leaves, and the fungi themselves would then become the nourishment for the ants, which is mostly protein source. And so that could be considered a type of farming, of harvesting, very primitive compared to the type of quaternary farming that we have going on today, and animal husbandry. Speaking of animal husbandry, there's also some other species of insects that do a little bit of animal husbandry. And these are called, what are they called? That they grow, and they crawl on trees, on bushes, on the stem of plants. Aphids or aphids, okay? These guys, sometimes they milk in quotations, they squeeze with their legs, they squeeze other animals or other species, and they get some little nourishment out of squeezing other species through the abdomen, okay? So that can be considered a kind of animal husbandry, if you will, in a very primitive way. So there are a few examples of animals that are doing some agriculture and some animal husbandry, and then tend to be in the large numbers, by the way. Also consider ants tend to be very populous and have a fairly extensive social system. And so the aphids tend to be quite numerous, all right? But my point with all this is that we have been into this log phase for several hundred years now. But the most challenging one is in the past 200 to 300 years, where we have gone into the Industrial Revolution, starting mostly in the Northwestern Hemisphere, mostly in Europe, and now spreading more throughout the world. But like I pointed out in the previous lecture, the challenge that fossil fuels, became the fuel of choice because of the carbohydrate, the carbon-carbon covalent bond, high energy bond, and the combination of that with the steam engine, and it just advanced industrialization hugely, I should say, so that and also the combustion engine later, so that the prevailing source of energy, of electricity today is still the steam engine, and the prevailing mode of transportation today is still the combustion engine, all right? Both of which emit the gas, the CO2 greenhouse gas. All right, I'm transitioning into the human population growth and challenges of this exponential growth curve into the billions, all right? And keep in mind that a billion is 10 to the 9. Okay, so this scale here is in the billions. You notice maybe 500 years ago is when we started hitting 1 billion. And in 500 years, we're getting close to 8 billion. We're about 7.8 or 7.9 billion right now. Okay, in just 500 years compared to thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years that it took us to get just to the 1 billion. Okay, so this is in drastic contrast. Our log phase is in drastic contrast with our lag phase. Okay, also points to the prowess of our human population. And that prowess has to turn into stewardship and not devastation, all right? So we have to lock into maturity and responsibility of behavior no matter what. Otherwise, we'll be our own destruction. Okay, I'm probably gonna break here. It's 11:15, yeah. Okay, so let me break here. I'm gonna get more in depth into the human population. I'm gonna leave this up for the break. But you can see now population density, and we're gonna start playing with a little arithmetic here, starting with some very basic concept of density, all right? And how do we go from there forward into behavior? So there's a little scale, hopefully you can see it. It's kind of small, but the more purple or violet it gets, the more high density of population. In other words, number of individual human beings per square kilometer, all right? I'm gonna keep it per square kilometer as a metric system of measurement. That's gonna be our standard. And so you can see the distribution here. A couple of things to keep in mind as we're going to the break, the equator, so that once again pointing out most of the land mass, vast majority of land mass is in the Northern Hemisphere. And as I point that out, don't miss the gray area, which is also land mass above sea level, all right, including Greenland, which has, of course, a huge ice sheet on top of it. So, but the coast is habitable and inhabited a little bit. All right, so the land mass includes all the northern areas of Canada, also it's known as the Northern Territories, and Siberia, which is huge also. Okay, it covers about half of the
Hello,
time
Father.
of the world. Mhm. Yeah,
Hello,
Luis.
Father.
Mhm.
Just to keep in mind that this is a distorted map, that as you go north and south, land actually expands the way it looks in the map, but if you
Yes.
bring it back to a sphere, of course, it's smaller. It's still significant, but not at this scale. This is just for the purpose of showing the flat screen,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
warping the thing.
Yeah, I think it's called the Mercator projection. I'm not sure.
Transverse Mercator.
Yeah,
Transverse.
Mercator or Mercator, which is the one that
Right.
gives us the flattened Earth.
Right.
So the Earth is flat, but it's only flat on a map, right? And this gives us a more accurate view of the landmass. And don't forget Antarctica down here, again, which is unlike the North Pole, it is a continent, all right? And so here in this map is omitted totally, but it's a landmass, but it's only populated by explorers and scientists seasonally. Mhm. Okay, so I leave you with this little map. It's 11:18, and I'm gonna start again at 11:30, all right? So I'll start up again 11:30. We're gonna break here for a moment. Before I do break, any particular brief question or comment, anything? Okay, I've introduced quite a few terms there. I think I've defined most of them, but again, I'm not infallible in any of these things. So if there's a term that I introduced that I haven't explained, please look it up or raise the question or ask about it, okay? All right, so let's pause recording. I'll see you at 11:30. Thanks. Okay, folks, I have 11:30, so coming back on and continuing with the lecture. All right. Hopefully you can hear me and see the screen. Can anyone confirm that for me, please? Anyone?
Yes,
Yeah,
I could see it.
Okay, super. Thank you, Marie. All right, moving forward. I want to say that, of course, we're going to get into human population growth here, that growth curve for the human, all right, species as a whole. And there will be bioethical implications on this because it's about human behavior at the end of the day. And some of it will be controversial. I'm going by the teachings of the Catholic Church, and we're going to touch, I can tell you right away, that we're going to touch on the issue of contraception and other issues of human sexuality that I've covered before also in previous lectures, okay? But let's see, I just ask that we keep all arguments respectful and civil, as we are capable of doing, of course, as responsible, mature adults that we are. So let's move forward then. We can see just from the map here, visually, that the most populated areas of the world are in Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and then Europe in general, and including Eastern Europe, parts of Eurasia, but mostly Europe. Then we have in what is known as Equatorial Africa, and also areas of Eastern South America and Western, Northwestern South America also, mostly coastlines. Mesoamerica, which includes Central America and Mexico, Caribbean, and then the United States, the eastern half of the United States in general, all right? And then along the coast, this is probably Anchorage, this little red dot up here. But in general, when it's not whole continents or subcontinents that are more densely populated, typically is coastlines, all right? Coastlines, and that is also kind of historical in the sense that historically, the coastlines are the ones that have provided for more flourishing in general, human flourishing by way of food sources, also trade and so forth, all right? But we can see a general swath here in the northwestern or between Europe, India, and Southeast Asia. That is the most, overall, the most densely populated areas of the world. Okay, let's move forward and look at the actual concept and reality of density, which is quite simply is number of individuals per area, all right, or per surface or per volume, individual items per surface or volume. In this case, we're looking at surface, land area, and I'm going to stick to the metric system in square kilometers. We can go back and forth with square miles just by using a converter online, punch in the numbers of one and ask for the other, I'll give you the other. But I'm sticking to square kilometers for the metric system simply because it's a scientific terminology, notation. If we do the math, we come up to about 52 persons per square kilometer for the total land mass. How do we do that? Okay, we're going to do a little bit of arithmetic here. First of all, before we go there, oh no, sorry. Here we go. Okay, so I have an Excel sheet here, and hopefully it's large enough that you can see it. Can people see the numbers on it? Anyone?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, so here we go. We have the world population right now is about 7.8 billion people. All right, so we put it in numbers. Here we have 7.8 billion. And the land area of the world in square kilometers is about almost 150 million square kilometers, 150 million of the total land mass, all right? Total land mass. So we can do a theoretical density of the world simply by dividing one number into the other. So which one do we need to divide? Which goes to get a density, right? It's a ratio, a density is a ratio, it's a fraction, number of individuals per surface in this case, not volume, but surface. And so we just take the numerator is going to be the number of individuals, the total number of individuals. And the denominator on the fraction is going to be the total land area in square kilometers. And that will bring it down to number of individuals per square kilometer for 1 square kilometer, all right? And that's the density. So the unit is square kilometer. How do we do that in Excel? Just a little brief review here. Well, we do to do an operation. So just a reminder that Excel is a spreadsheet that allows you to do a lot of arithmetic and geometry and graphs and statistics on it. So it's our tool, it's our friend, all right? To do an operation in a cell, by the way, columns, just a very brief review, columns go vertically and are noted by letters in the alphabet, beginning with the A, and rows, so that's a column, column. Rows are denoted, are horizontally and are numbered, beginning with 1, so on down, okay? So the intersection of a row and a column is known as a cell. This is a cell, so we can refer, the notation for referring to any cell in here is by the letter and the number. So the letter, which kind of equivalent to a graph, where we put X comma Y, right, is a notation in parentheses for any point on a graph. The same here, X-axis is horizontal, so A2, for example, this is cell B2, this is cell B2, and this cell here is A5, and so forth. We can refer to any cell in here by a combination of a letter and a number, okay? So We're going to do an operation here in cell C2. And to do an operation, I put an equal sign first from the keyboard, and then I click into the cell that I want in the operation. First, I want a fraction here. I need number of persons per kilometer square, right? So I go over here with my mouse, and this is the number of persons on the world. So I click in there, and automatically it captures that cell B2, all right? Then I have to put the sign of the operation, whatever operation I want, and I want a division. Here's the fraction sign, right? So the / bar on the keyboard denotes a fraction or a division. Multiplication, well, we'll get to multiplication later, I'll show you the sign. And then we capture the other cell. The denominator is going to be the land area here, okay? Now we have defined our equation. We want the density to be equal to the total number of the world population of humans divided by the total land mass on Earth. That should give us the density of persons per square kilometer. So to execute the operation, simply hit enter, bingo. So, and that's rounded to the nearest whole number, rounded to the nearest whole number because we cannot have 0.7 people, all right? So it needs to be rounded to the nearest whole number, 52. So this means that the population of the human species today on Earth is approximately 52 persons per square kilometer. 52 persons per square kilometer. That's for the entire landmass of Earth, all right? Now, I forgot to show you these numbers earlier, so let me go back there for a moment. The diagram of, oh, here it is. Yeah. Oh yeah, okay, so this is the number 52, and I call it theoretic. You'll see why in a minute, because it involves the total landmass, total surface. Now, if we were to project that on our property of St. Thomas University, just to give you a feel for what 52 people per square kilometer looks like, all right? If we were to spread them out more or less evenly, what does it look like, 52 people in a square kilometer? All right, St. Thomas, our measurements is almost a square, but it's actually a rectangle. And here's the scale from Google Earth. This little green bar is 100 meters. You can barely see it here. When you get the PowerPoint, you'll see this is 100 meters. That's why I wanted to use a metric system, because we're going to go from meters to kilometers. This little green bar is 100 meters. So you see the green bar here, the red, the yellow, and the blue are the same size, just different color. So we can count and we can figure out what is the dimensions of our lot of our university, so we can figure out the area, all right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bars of 100 meters each makes 800 meters from east to west or west to east, whichever way you want to go. All right, so we have 800 meters across horizontally on our property. And if we do the same exercise going vertically, we have 7 bars, so we got 700 meters. Our property is 800 by 700 meters. Once we have those dimensions, we can figure out the area. How do we do that? We just multiply them, all right? Sorry, so let's go back to the spreadsheet for a moment, and Excel does our work. Here in meters, that's our units. We got 700 and 800. I'm just using this to capture these cells. So we're gonna convert this first to kilometers. Here in this cell, equal how many kilometers in a meter, right? So we have to capture this number. So we capture that cell and divide it by how many meters in a kilometer? 1,000. Right? That's why it's called kilo, because kilo in Greek is 1,000. So we divide this number by 1,000 and we get kilometers, right? Which is obviously going to be a decimal. And we do the same for the 800. I'm going to show you another little thing about spiffy, about Excel. So 700 meters is obviously 0.7 kilometers, right? Now, highlight the cell and mouse to this corner, the lower right corner, till you get a cross. You see that cross? Click it and pull down. And it will do the same operation, but for the next cells, okay? It will do the same operation for the next cell. So you can continue to scroll down. This is going to give me an error because there's nothing here. But this one, so let's look inside at the operation. You can see the operation here. All right. It's taking cell A6, which is 700, dividing it by 1,000, gives us a 0.7. But if you click on this cell, it's taking cell A7, right? And still dividing it by the 1,000 because 1,000 here is a constant number. But what is changing is the cell. So the program has that little memory that it remembers. If you do it consecutively, you can do this for a whole table. If you have a lot of numbers here and you're dividing or multiplying or adding, subtracting a constant number, you can just pull down on this little cross and it will do all the math for you. All right? Okay. Okay. Whoops. I want to delete all that. Yes. All right, so I'm doing this operation to see in these numbers how many square kilometers we have on the property, how many square kilometers, because the property again is 7.7 kilometers by 0.8 kilometers. All right, so here we're going to figure out this kilometer square. So again, we're going to do the operation equal sign. Now we're going to multiply these two numbers, right? We're going to multiply these two numbers to get the surface, the area. We multiply length times height. So we capture this cell, and now the multiplication is the asterisk, which is on top of number 8. So shift, hold shift down and press 8 gives you the asterisk. Again, hold down shift and press number 8 gives you the asterisk, which means multiplication for Excel, and then capture the other cell and then execute by pressing enter. All right, so it's about half a kilometer square. The caret means square, all right? So we have about half a kilometer square approximately. That means that for STU, if it's 52 people per square kilometers, what's your intuition? For half a kilometer, approximately, it would be approximately half this number, right? Or if this is 52, the density of the world is 52 people per square kilometer, for half a kilometer, it would be about half that number. Let's get a more accurate number. Again, a new cell, equal. Now, what do? I take this density per square kilometer and multiply it times this fraction of a kilometer. All right, so I need to capture this cell and then again multiply, but I'm multiplying by a fraction. So multiplying by a fraction or by a decimal is going to give us a smaller number. And the cell that I need now is the portion of square kilometers that we have on campus. So now we have our two cells and multiply or execute, we get 29. So that means that if we were to represent on our campus the density of the world population, it would be equivalent to having 29 persons on campus scattered throughout the campus, all right, throughout our half kilometer. So what does that look like? More or less like this, little red figures, okay, more or less. So you get a graphic view of the density. Of course, these figures are gigantic. They're huge compared to what an actual human being would look at this scale. But this is more or less the density on our campus for the world population. 29 people for the half kilometer square that we have of area, of surface. Just to get a feel of the current density of the world population. However, I call this theoretical, right? Call it theoretical because it turns out that about half of the world is uninhabited and uninhabitable because the climate is so harsh, at least for a stable population of civilians, not some explorer or scientist that goes in here with huge amount of equipment and technology to survive for a period of time. But about half of the world is uninhabited, typically for extreme climate, either desert. Look at Australia. Most of Australia is a huge desert, all right? Also Sahara in Africa, the Amazon basin. The Midwest is just sparsely populated, but vast tracts of the northern hemispheres of the northern territories of Canada, Greenland, again, and Siberia, and Antarctica, okay? So more or less about half of the world is not habitable. That means that we have to cut our numbers into half, or actually double the density, because if we cut the surface to half, we cut the surface of the Earth, the habitable surface to half, then we essentially need to double the population density, right? So a more realistic number is 104 persons per kilometer square. 104 is a more realistic number of our human population density today. If we project that to our little campus, then it means more like 59 people, because there was a decimal there, it rounded up, okay? It comes to about 59 people, and this is what it would look like. So just to flash back and forth, this would be ideally with all the landmass, but because half of the landmass on Earth is not really inhabitable, then it looks more like this. If we were to spread out the population evenly throughout the habitable landmass on Earth. But even this is not the real picture, because we don't have an even distribution of the population throughout the habitable area surface of the Earth, okay? And that is very obvious from this design. Otherwise, if we had an even distribution of the human population throughout the habitable area of the Earth, then we wouldn't have any purple or violet, maybe not even red. We'd have mostly orange or green. We'd have mostly orange or yellow throughout the whole Earth because it would be evenly distributed, okay? Maybe not even orange. Maybe we'd be down to 10 or 15. No, it would have to be in the range of the orange. Yeah, as I just said, it would be in the range of the orange. But we don't have that at all. We have massive concentrations of people in relatively small land areas, land mass, all right? And now I want to introduce another topic, which is the issue of megalopolis. Megalopolis. What are megalopolis? Megalopolis are cities, excuse me, that have over 10 million people, okay? Living in one concentrated area, one huge high density area. These are megalopolis. There happen to be now about 45 of them. When I started looking at this way back in the 70s and 80s, when I was beginning to study biology and so forth, as a young adult, I can tell you they were like 8 or 9 megalopolis in the world, okay? It's a shame that at that time I didn't record it, and I just haven't had the time or the energy to look at that, but it would be interesting to see the development of megalopolis. Obviously, when we go back, this has to do with this, right? If we go back in time, even to the beginning of the century, I don't even know if we would find maybe one megalopoly at the beginning of last century, or 2, who knows? But 10 million people living in one particular area, all right? High density. And how those megalopolis have grown my intuition is that they parallel this growth curve. They have grown exponentially, not linearly, not linear, but exponentially, okay? And they say about human behavior that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? Which could be alarming if we continue to grow megalopolis at an exponential rate. Big danger. Let me show you something. So here, okay, I did the realistic. We're gonna do that. We're gonna skip it. It was just doubling the number of population density because we're halving the denominator. All right, so here are these 45 megalopolis. At the low end is this city of Harbin in China, with a little over 10 million people. All right, moving up on the Excel sheet here to number 1 in population density, which is this area, the vast metropolitan area called Tokyo, Yokohama, right? Which has almost 38 million people, 30 million people. Then Delhi, very close to it, 35. Shanghai, 34, etc. If we take the first 10, all right, 4 of the first 10, the largest megalopolis are in China. Follow suit from this map. Okay. And 9 of the first 10 are in Asia, with the big exception of New York City. Then we wonder why the coronavirus took off there. Then if we look at the ones who are 20 million or above, 20 million or above, of those, 10 of those are in Asia. Okay, so this 9 plus this one is 10, Mumbai. And then 2 are in North America. Then 1 in South America, Sao Paulo. Actually, I thought that Rio was larger, but Sao Paulo. And then Cairo in Egypt, 1 in Africa. So of the 20 million or above, there are 10 in Asia, 2 in North America, 1 in South America, and 1 in Africa. But this is a dynamic thing, right? It keeps going, and you can look at the numbers there. I did some adding here to arrive at the, we see that, let's look at these numbers. When we add up this 45 megalopolis, all right, let me see if I can make this a little bigger. Hopefully you can see those numbers on the screen. We add up just these megalopolis. These are 45, it says 46 here, but the first level, the first number is the titles, okay? So it's 45, oops. They add up to 416 million people, 416 million. This number is a little outdated. It's from last year's 500, probably updated here because I did the same math. We said that it was 7.8, right? Billion. Hopefully I got it right. Yeah. All right. So I did some math over here. This is the density, the percentage of people of the world. This is the percentage of people in the world that are living in 45 cities. More than 10% of the whole human population is living in 45 cities. Now you can imagine how many thousands of cities we have throughout the world. I don't know. I don't know, but it's easy to say that they're in the thousands, maybe in the tens of thousands of cities, right? And more than 10% of our population, of our world population, lives in 45 cities. That is extremely high population density. So what I'm trying to say is, with regards to this overpopulation of the world and how people toss that thing around that we're overpopulated, in the world as a whole, with all due respect, no, we're not overpopulated in the world as a whole. In fact, in the world as a whole, we're kind of underpopulated. But we have this huge megalopolis, this huge high concentration, because we are a very sociable species, and that's part to do of the blame of the spikes of the coronavirus, that we're so sociable. We like to cluster and gather, even at high risk. We like to cluster and gather and socialize, even at the risk of health or life, right? And that, when we play it forward for decades and centuries, we end up with these high density regions, all right? And there's a general flight from the rural area to the urban area. We see it even in the States, because the lights attract the people. That's where more technology is available. That's where more people are available. That's where the better everything is available in general, okay? And so there's a general flight from rural areas to urban areas. I guess in a sense we can say that it's a harsher life in the rural area. One has to work more to carve out a living, but it can be carved out. In contrast to that, and again, I'm giving you my opinion as I see the thing over the years and decades that I've lived, excuse me, not only in the US, but in other parts of the world too. It takes more skill in general to live in the urban area because there's more competition. It stands to reason. And so when we have people that are less skilled in urban areas, that's a big danger. It's a danger in the sense that they are at higher risk of becoming ill, of becoming ill-suited, not being able to survive in the urban area because they lack the skills, right? No. It obviously begs the question about education, right? So that's one big challenge that we have, is the education of the world. But also keep in mind that someone has to work the land one way or another, okay? Someone has to work the land because at the end of the day, we're still being maintained by agriculture and animal husbandry. I also wanted to point out, excuse me, the two numbers that I've seen that I can't put my finger in it right now, but I remember from years ago, the numbers that were being floated around that we produce about 4 times as much food to feed the whole world right now. We produce about 4 times as much food. I think it was in a missionary magazine that I saw it actually, an article. 4 times as much food to feed the whole world. That comes mostly from that quaternary, tertiary, and quaternary agriculture that we have become so efficient, yes, including the Midwest, the breadbasket of the United States, which also is a big basket for the rest of the world, but other parts of the world too. So we produce about 4 times, we humans produce about 4 times the amount of food that is needed to feed the whole world today. Now, that is in gross. When that food is stored and moved and so forth, we lose about half of that production, to a mixture of rodents and fungi and decomposition, organic decomposition and rot, all right? So we lose about half of the production of food from agriculture and animal husbandry to nature, to rot, to fungi, to bacterial infection, and to rodents, et cetera, which means that we still have a net of twice as much food to feed the whole world, on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is why I think it was from that missionary journal, is that about half of the world's population, half of the 7 billion, goes to bed at night hungry. About half the population. How could it be? If we have a net production of twice the amount of food and about half of the world goes hungry, it would be that everyone should be satisfied. In principle, you know, theoretically, everyone has plenty of food, has twice the amount of food that we need, but we don't. One way or another, no matter how we cut this, in my mind, after going around it, it comes down to the corruption of the human heart, right? The corruption of the human heart. It has been already in the news over years and years. You see the sacks of grain, for example, that is given for humanitarian aid by the UN and other agencies, by Catholic Relief Services and many other humanitarian agencies in the world. You see the sacks of grain and food that is given for humanitarian purposes to get to the local villages, to get to the people for free, right? Administered by the local governments. You see them in the marketplace, open with a knife to be sold to the people in the best case scenario, all right? And so the corruption of the human heart. And that's, to me, is the bioethical challenge in the behavior, the human behavior. And don't get me wrong, I'm the first one whose heart is corrupted, okay? We're all corrupted because we're on this side of the fall. But there's corruption and there's corruption. And to me, that's where it comes down to, is to try to live the most mature, responsible life as possible and getting others to do the same. Now, how do we do that at the level of organizations, at the level of transnational organizations, and even at the level of governments and United Nations and so forth, okay? So this flight from the rural to the urban is a big danger for our society in general. We need to have incentives so that people, sufficient people stay in the rural areas to do the work that is needed there and still live a significant, productive, satisfied, fulfilled life, okay? We also have the kind of mini flight from the urban to the rural, for example, in the desire for the suburban areas, because the suburban areas, when you think about them, for example, I think of West Kendall here in Miami, I don't know what's in Broward, Weston or things like that. You know, it's like having your mini forest, having your mini environment, your mini ecosystem around you, so it looks pretty and it doesn't look like the concrete jungle, all right? So there is always that desire in the human heart to have some nature around us, I know in Europe, for example, in Italy, the desire of many Italians is to have the little tenuta. The tenuta is a little piece of land that they have outside the city where they go on the weekends. And in the tenuta, they plant tomatoes and food and so forth, you know, and they typically go there, even if it's a small acreage, because again, Europe has high population density, okay? Very challenging because of the limited amount of area that they have any longer. So population density is an issue, and by saying population density, also growth rate. And I wanted to, let me go to the development goals for a moment of the UN, since I've mentioned the UN several times, and then back to the article that I just circulated to you yesterday from this week's BBC on the drastic decline on the human population that is foreseen statistically, pushing it forward, all right? Counterintuitive to this graph here. Okay, so here we are with the Millennium Summit, year 2000, okay? And the first goal was this one by 2015, very ambitious by the UN to have these 8 development goals that were called the Millennium Development Goals. You can look them up. To eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, to reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and global partnership for development. Okay? This was at the UN Millennium Summit in the year 2000, the ambitious goals to achieve in 15 years. Well, now 2015 has come and gone, and some of this has been achieved in some places, but certainly not to the fullest, right? Also, we know that it gets ideological and so forth, but basically, in principle, taken at their face value, these are laudable goals, right? And the embarrassment that we haven't reached them, and that, in fact, that we are here to establish these are goals because of the gross inequalities that we see among human populations, or between human populations, or different parts of the population, human population in the world. Sadly, though, when this was not achieved, new summits of the UN have set further goals, more than doubling the goals, all right, to be achieved in the next, now 10 years, but 15 from here. By 2030, by the year 2030, these 17 goals that have been set by the UN, all right, no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality of education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, and the partnerships for the goals that are required to make these goals happen, right? Okay, now, I don't know that these are ranked, frankly, but in my opinion, I would start backwards. I would actually start with the partnerships and work for peace and justice. Imagine if we got these two done, of the partnerships and the peace and justice, the others would follow, would be a natural, logical consequence of the partnerships and the peace and justice, right? Because inequality goes against justice, and irresponsible consumption goes against peace, and so forth. So this is, anyway, what the UN is offering us. It's also challenging because if these were ambitious, these were extremely ambitious. No poverty by 2030, no hunger by 2030. I would love it, but how realistic is it? The words from Jesus's mouth, the poor you will always have with you, all right? And how do we deal with that in a responsible way, coming out from the mouth of God incarnate? Challenging, very challenging. Anyway, this leads me at least one part, which is now going on the theological, and this is Catholic theology, to the human population growth rate and the flash news, the jaw dropper that the BBC is saying that essentially by 2100, we're going to reach the climax community for the human population. 2100, we're talking about 80 years from now. That's in 4 generations, 4 human generations. How many thousands of generations did it take us to get here, right? To jump from 0, 1 billion to 8 billion, maybe it stabilizes around 9 billion, and then it starts going flat. And if we're not careful, it will start diminishing. And it's really anybody's guess, and whatever statistical model projection you want to use to project out and predict that future, if that stability is going to continue to decrease or increase, but this sharp, just as it was sharp interfacing from lag to log, it looks like we're going to achieve an equally sharp interfacing between log and stable, all right? Due in large part, again, quoting that article that I sent you, to 2 particular factors. The education of women, a huge plus, absolutely. I would be insane to say that we should not educate women, of course, all right? So, but the education of women in particular, which was long overdue, but the introduction of contraception. And this one is what I see as a big, huge, huge negative, sadly, on the human behavior, okay? Because why? Because it introduces an artificial population control that appeals, again, this is now, I'm going into my opinion, but also backed up by Catholic teaching, all right? It introduces an artificial device, whether it's chemical, mechanical combination, like I taught, like we saw in the previous course, all right, on the beginning of life issues, that appeals more to the selfishness of the human heart than to the generosity of the human heart, okay? And this is a reality that we as mature, responsible adults need to come to grip with. Just like there is a general flight from the rural to the urban, there is also a general flight away from children. Because in a realistic human way, they're a hassle, they're a burden. They have to be maintained, you know, and they're dirty and they get in trouble and they cost money and resources and so forth. So it appeals, contraception appeals to the selfishness of our nature, which is there in every single one of us, all right? And we have to be very careful with that, because the alternative that is proposed by the Catholic Church is natural family planning. Again, not the rhythm, but truly scientific natural family planning, which at the end of the day gives us the same accuracy as, for example, the pill, which is considered one of the most accurate contraceptives, all right? But in contrast with the pill, it does require discipline. It requires order in life. It requires order and discipline in the most difficult of relationships between humans, which is the sexual relationship, right? And that's the challenge. So I'm kind of leaving it there. We got about 15 minutes to deal with this hot potato. But basically, what I'm proposing is that we could stabilize that population, but it would require, if we get away from the contraceptives, it would require a much more responsible, mature, selfless, generous way of life. Before I leave the teaching mode, kind of, I also want to say that, having said that, from the Catholic perspective, artificial contraception is not the solution, but natural family planning is the solution. I'm not advocating for irresponsible human sexual activity. I'm certainly totally 100%, 1,000% against the irresponsible behavior of some men in the world, of many men in the world, that go around fertilizing women as a bumblebee goes around fertilizing flowers, okay? And also the overall situation of the women who either tolerate that or have been imposed that because of the oppressive systems that do occur in many parts of the world. And I've lived in Latin America enough to know that it occurs. It also occurs in North America, it occurs in Europe and many places of the world. But in general, it tends to occur more in the less industrialized places of the world in general, okay? Anyway, the solution from the Catholic perspective is not to have a child every 9 months at all, is to have one man and one woman to live together for the rest of their lives, committed to raising the children that God gives them, with the desire for children, a natural desire for children that should be responsible. And that lands me on this little encyclical called Humane Vitae by Paul VI, okay? That in 1968, just 8 years after the pill was legalized in the United States and went spread like wildfire throughout the whole world, tells us that the better alternative, the best alternative, according to God's plan, is precisely responsible parenting, not planned parenting, but responsible parenting, right? To have the number of children that should be had responsibly. It's a very, very personal decision between the couple, of course, and it's a decision that should be reviewed periodically. I don't want to repeat the lecture from last semester, but basically you understand what I'm talking about in the context of beginning of life issues, all right? So on the one hand, no contraceptive. On the other hand, responsible parenting by natural family planning, which can achieve between one man and one woman together for the rest of their lives with the grace of God, with that third party, okay, of the grace of God to help them achieve that challenge. Okay, I see a couple of chats already, so let me see that. Okay, Siobhan, I'm gonna just read this out loud here. Maybe by not increasing the world population and using contraception responsibly, by not destroying the world with the excess carrying capacity of the population. How is moral to let the population increase? Contraception and education of women are the prime factors for alleviating poverty. Maybe church teaching need to change. Maybe if women's voices were heard. Okay, well, maybe I can start with the last here. Well, let me see, anyone, so there was also another chat. Did it go away? Or I thought I saw two chats, but anyway, all right. Anyone want to respond to this? We have about 10 minutes, more or less. Anyone else have another comment that they want to add or a question?
Professor, if people are having less and less children, so what would that basically mean? Like, what kind of projection would that be for us in the future? Because wouldn't we need people to do, like, to cultivate the world and to do certain things within the world?
Exactly. Thank you for the question. Yes, again, the human population is not exempt from other population, other natural populations. Okay, remember that we are also part of nature. In spite of the fact that we have grown such an artificial lifestyle and artificiality that surrounds us entirely, we're still, human nature is part of nature, okay? And so to your question, Marie, it's excellent because we're in an Adamic state. You know, it's not like the rest of us are waiting for more children to be born to keep us alive. No, we continue to age, myself included, and the rest of us, we're all aging. And so as we age, we're less productive from the material sense, all right? And so someone else has to be more productive to keep us alive, to keep them plus us alive, all right? The younger, I'm talking about the younger generation coming into the workforce to work enough to produce enough taxes to maintain us who are going on to Social Security, okay, with less work and some income still coming in. So that when that dynamic changes and the population of the country starts to age, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. We're seeing that in Europe right now, that the population is aging because for decades already, the Europeans have gone beyond, have gone below replacement level. And let's talk about the replacement level, which is 2.1. It described it in the article and explained a little bit what's going on there. The natural intuition is 2, right? Because me and my sibling replace my 2 parents, but it doesn't work quite like that because there's child mortality and other factors that come in. The bottom line is that for us, for humans, each population has a replacement level, all right? And for us, it's 2.1 children, all right? To maintain, to stabilize, to keep us at the climax community, let's say, to be the dominant species of the world, of the climax community, assuming that the climate doesn't change drastically on us, right? We need 2.1 children to maintain, to stay stable. All right. What happens is that many countries now, an increasing, let me put it this way, an increasing number of countries are going below the replacement level, below. So their populations are diminishing. Their national populations are diminishing, right? They're going to depend more and more on immigration. They'll have to make actually incentives to bring people in. To do the work that the aging, their local aging population is no longer doing or no longer wants to do and so forth, okay? So this represents big social problems and God forbid that we start getting into or continue getting into social engineering, Where, for example, look at China and the disaster. They admitted it themselves when they tried to do this population control and limit the number of children to 1. That is less than half of the replacement level. Less than 1, yeah, sure. Okay, so Southeast Asia, this is a big part of China, but look at the rest of China. It's empty. This, Mongolia is totally very, very empty, all right? And so when they made that national policy enforced by the government, where women were actually being forced into having abortions because they had more than 1 child, then naturally the human nature kicks in. Human nature kicks in. And so what do they want? They want more men, they want more boys and girls, because boys, they can get more work out of the boys than the girls, you know, and so forth. And the girls, they're harder to get married and so forth. And so there was a skew in the population to the point that now there is a significantly larger population of men in China than women. And I mentioned this before already. Now they fight, they literally fight for the women. These men fight in factories and other places because there are not enough women to go around, because they upset the balance of more or less 50-50, half and half, so that there is approximately 1 man for every woman on Earth, you see? And they do these population control things run by a corrupt government that is very sad, because it's using people as machines, as robots, all right, to maintain the oligarchy, and it's that lacks nothing except scruples. And so we have these challenges, but think about it. Just, I ask you to think about it. Contraception feeds into that selfish mentality of either postponing the children to the point that now they're in the 30s, and that's another natural biological clock. You know, in the 30s, on average, sperm continues to be vigorous, but eggs get old. They get old because of the biology that we know, and I'm not going to repeat. And so the number of defects tend to increase exponentially, Down syndrome and others. All right. So by postponing those births, women unwittingly or on purpose, you know, are working against themselves and against the next generations. And so what happens also, human nature being what it is, well, we postpone it so long, we might as well give it up altogether. These are challenging. These are challenging issues. Let me stop talking for a moment and get some more comments here. All right. Okay, let me take this one from Maggie. The majority of my friends have no children, or only 1, but most have 1. It's not my place to ask them why, but I have to wonder. I also wonder if the women have not been rendered sterile due to years of using oral contraception. Again, it's there. And also due to STDs, which have never been identified, but have taken their toll over the years. Yeah, I can tell you STDs have become epidemic since contraception, precisely because it just fosters irresponsible sexual activity, saying, you know, it doesn't hurt anybody except the women who now are exposed to more sexual activity and intimacy, even when they don't necessarily want it, right? Because, you know, you're not getting pregnant anyway, so why are you denying yourself to me? Okay, a comment from Marie, that's very interesting, Maggie. I wonder if your friends or people in general aren't having or wanting children because of the times we live in with the economy. In my opinion, contraception and STD should be a possibility for that as well. Okay, more messages. No, they are not sterile, Maggie, and I doubt highly that STDs are so prevalent. They have caused sterility. Well, there seems to be some evidence about that. The reason is more like that women have tried to find their own moral agency and reproductive life. Yes, right, okay. I want to address a little bit the issue of moral agency. Absolutely, yes. Siobhan, I'm with you. We all need to have our moral agency, okay? But keep in mind that the moral agency is individual and also collective, okay? Because with regards to the human behavior, with the sexual behavior of humans, unlike any other type of behavior, more more graphically in the sexual behavior, I have a double responsibility. I have a responsibility to myself, but I also have a responsibility to the next generation, right? Because it's still the only way that we can make that next generation is somehow by the fertilization of sperm and egg. Mm-hmm. So the moral agency, perhaps I should stop here and actually ask the question, what do you mean by moral agency? Because maybe we're not talking about the same issue here. May I ask Shaban, so what do you mean by moral agency?
What I mean is the fact that women can decide their role in society, that women have a right and an obligation to make choices about motherhood and what they want to do with their lives. And it is not just a collective responsibility. And to prescribe roles to people because of society pressures or the way we've always done it does not make it right. And women should have the right to control their destiny. And by not believing or hearing the voice of women is just, I think, is abhorrent. And I don't believe the Catholic Church does listen to women in their whole lives. And frankly, this idea, when we're talking about population control and a Catholic view of natural family planning, how does that impact truly the world if I think the most populous religion in the world is Muslim? And other people, if you look at India and China, they are not Catholic. So unless we undertake some vast evangelization, I think we're fiddling while Rome is burning, metaphorically.
Right, okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I couldn't agree with you more, Siobhan, okay? I really couldn't agree with you more, except for a couple of details, but you did bring them up. So let me say this, absolutely. Women have the right and the responsibility to have the moral agency over their reproduction, right? Over their procreation, which, by the way, I want to get away from the word of reproduction because of the connotation of being just animalistic, whereas procreation involves the human conscience, the human heart, the human spirit, but so do men, right? So do men. In other words, if you think about it, contraception lets the man get away scot-free, totally scot-free, realistically, where the tire meets the road on the ground, you know, it lets the man get away from the responsibility. And so if women need that moral agency and it needs to be supported, encouraged, promoted, so do men. So do men.
Father, with all due respect, women are not dependent.
Excuse me, Siobhan, hold on.
No, Father.
Saying, so let me finish my thought, please. Let me finish my thought.
I'm done.
So if men also took moral agency and responsibility about the number of children they have, okay, and consider to have the intercourse when the women want to have the intercourse and so forth, introduce, just inject into your equation the element of responsibility from both parts, which at the end of the day is going to be a sacrificial love, all right? It's a sacrificial love. It's the toughest type of love, all right? And so what I find is that when women were given this material device, this physical device, whether it's mechanical or chemical, to render them infertile, they essentially became what the irresponsible men wanted, which
Father,
is
you
to
just
have
said,
the little sexual machine.
Father, excuse
Please
me.
allow me to finish my thought.
Father, I'm sorry. This
Marie?
is just beyond. You
Okay.
talk about,
Marie, I've asked you, sorry, Siobhan, I've asked you several times to, let me finish the thought, okay? Thank you. So, the other thing that you mentioned was evangelization, unless we evangelize the world. But that is precisely the challenge. And that is precisely also the opportunity. And that is what Jesus Christ came to introduce into this world, all right? Which is the challenge of Christianizing the world. In other words, what I'm trying to say here, in so many words, is that the event of Jesus Christ, in other words, the incarnation of God, is not a side event, it's not a side issue, it's not really an option for our flourishing, for our human flourishing, because when God decided to communicate himself to us fully, he became a human being. He did not become a palm tree or an orangutan. He became a human being. And so that means that we are special, with a very special responsibility to promote respectfully, but continuously, to evangelize the world into this challenge that we call Christianity, all right? And it is a challenge, and it's a challenge all the way to the cross, and he showed us the way. But the alternative is going to be utilitarian manipulation of people one way or another. So when we think about it, we're asking all of us who have received some degree of Christianity, all right, in our journey, to consider the treasure that we have and to continue to promote that treasure as we ourselves grow in our Christianity, all right, and in our giving, in our selfishness, to encourage the others who surround us in that same mentality, in that same mindset, in that same spirit. And so we have a tradition that goes back to 2,000 years, and even beyond that, if we tap into the monotheistic tradition of the Jewish people too, right, that it can be done. Now, we can also consider that the message of Jesus Christ is actually pie in the sky. It's actually unattainable. You know, it's when you compare it to these goals of the Millennium Goals, right? These are the goals of Jesus Christ, and we're just late. We're 2,000 years late, okay? But we need to strive for this goal, but properly understood, and it starts here. It starts with peace and justice. This is one of the first encyclicals, the social encyclical on the social teaching of the church, Pacem in Terris, all right? We need to continue this tradition of the social justice properly understood, of the dignity and the sanctity of the human person, and strive for that. So it's going to be a challenge all the way around. It's going to be a challenge. There's another chat here. I'm trying to say is that we need to move away from the things that lower our human flourishing, our human, not flourishing, our human responsibility. We need to move away from the couch and the air conditioning, all right? We need to get into the fray of the difficulty of life, of the challenge of life, but ultimately of the generosity of life in its fullest expression. The challenge that it is, and some of you are married, you know, or have been married, the challenge that it is to stay with that one partner for the rest of your life, no matter what comes, so that the separation is not really an option, for example. That is extremely challenging, all right? Extremely challenging. And so that's what God expects from us. So unless we're willing to say that God really is pie in the sky, that he's asking us something that we cannot achieve, I'm not ready to say that, frankly. In fact, I have committed my life already for 35 years to say quite the opposite, that the challenge of God can be achieved, may be achieved with sacrifice and with plenty of rewards and happiness and fulfillment along the way, okay? So restraint, discipline, order, and real generous love is achievable. I have witnessed it in my own life and in the life of many people around me. And I'm just encouraging whoever is listening to me to try to do that. And many people are doing it. They are doing it. Okay? So, but the technological fix specifically of the contraceptive, you will see, because it will be played out. And it's not going to be tomorrow, you know, or the day after tomorrow, that everyone is going to turn generous all of a sudden, just like that. But you will see it play out, and time will tell. Time will tell. But here is already a warning in this week of July of 2020 of what may be coming to us in 4 generations or less. Okay, I see I've gone beyond. Some people are still on. If anyone has parting comments to make. Okay, some people are leaving already. Don't worry, this is all being recorded and you'll get it anyway to the bitter end. So, any parting comments?
Father, the idea that women have not been using contraception since the beginning of time is really not accurate. They have been, and women have tried to control their reproductive lives. Simply technology has made it perhaps easier, better, but I think your whole worldview is male-centric. It is not, reproductive freedom is not something that has been given to women by men any more than citizenship has been given to African Americans in this country. They deserve it as an innate right for living here. And this idea that we give people something, I find is just offensive. Even if you are correct that the church is going to be able to evangelize the world, what happens in the meantime if the world goes, you know, just cannot sustain this?
Mm-hmm. Right, okay.
It seems it's a big moral, there's a bigger moral issue in not trying to control the world's population than it is to wait.
Right. Okay, look, Shaban, I think that we have many of the same concerns for sure. But I think that the core issue here is perhaps the way that we are analyzing sexual intimacy as not just reproduction, but procreation. In other words, introducing the element of God and grace and truly being God's image, right? So I just want to reference, and I'm going to leave with this. I want to reference again Humanae Vitae. I'm going to make an invitation to reread, because you should all have read Humanae Vitae. I've talked about 15 little pages that we ran through briefly last semester in the beginning of life issues, okay? But just consider the inside of Pope Paul VI when he called out the insight that contraception introduces that artificial separation between the unitive and the procreative dimensions of the human sexual intercourse, all right? And so it does violence to human sexual intercourse as fully human. So I'm just gonna reference that, invite you to go back to the videos that we talked about that, but reread Humanae Vitae with an open heart and open mind, okay? And with that, that's my closing thoughts. So I'm gonna end the recording here, but of course, to be picked up next week. So thanks again, everyone, for participating. We're not done yet, okay? Like the maestro said, it's not done until it's done. So we'll have another round of it next week, God willing, looking more deeply into climate change. Let me see. So again, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, have a safe week, everyone. Be responsible, okay? We'll see you next week, God willing. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.